we recognized the need to reconcile a painful part of our history. Our participation in the institution of slavery and the benefit we received from the sale of 272 enslaved children, women, and men from Jesuit plantations in Maryland in 1838. The person responsible for the sale was then serving in a leadership role for the Society of Jesus. His name was Father Thomas Milady, and it was for him that one of our oldest buildings was named. We formally removed the name of Thomas Milady from this building, as well as the name of another Georgetown president of this period, Father William McSherry, from a second building. We will offer a Mass of Reconciliation in which we will seek forgiveness for our participation in the institution of slavery, and specifically for the sale of 272 children, women, and men, whom we should regard as members of our community.
Well, in one sense, there was nothing surprising in the working group. I mean, all this history had been documented before, multiple times. I mean, that's one of the things that's really interesting about it, right? Is here's a history that Georgetown had investigated on multiple occasions, and then somehow let fall into the background. And that's really interesting, right? Even as recently as the 1980s and 1990s, hundreds of students on this campus were reading this history, going through these documents. It was a regular part of the American Studies curriculum, and somehow that fell out of regular use. And that actually is somewhat surprising to me, is how quickly we can let things slip into the background.
This is a letter that is dated February the 5th, 1815. It's written by Brother Joseph Moberly, who was overseer at one of the plantations in Maryland at St. Inigo's. And Father Moberly was an early proponent of the idea that the Jesuits should no longer own slaves. This letter is written to John Grassi, who was president of Georgetown in 1815, but he was also head of the Maryland province as well.
So amongst the documents that were key to the Jesuit Plantation Project was a set of scans of, not all of, but a significant number of the pages of the first volume of Joseph Moberly's diary. You get a sense of what he thinks it's like to be a Catholic in a mostly Protestant land. He's really irritated about the abolitionist movement. He is not fond of Methodists or Presbyterians. And he spends some time taking on the identity of a Quaker, and how a Quaker farmer comes to exist in the agricultural world without the burden of slavery. So we've got this Quaker farmer from Pennsylvania that he's thinking about, and he contrasts that with the unprofitable state of farming tobacco in Maryland with enslaved folks. And so he's trying to figure out where the Jesuits sit in the world, but he's a guy who really has no power.
You know, how does somebody like Moberly, or how does a Jesuit make sense of their identity as a Catholic, as a Jesuit, and as a slave owner? And that's something that Moberly actually directly addresses in his writings. He says, what's he say? Let me think about this. He says, can a man serve God faithfully and possess slaves? Yes. And so I think that he was very concerned with maintaining hierarchy, and slavery was a way of holding onto that rigid social structure that positioned him, as a person in control, as a person with power.
And then he follows that up with this notion that if there's any kind of corporal punishment, then the slaves are really, really unhappy and kind of complain higher up the chain. And so that suggests to me that there's a distinct possibility that the person they're complaining about is him.
Do you have any idea why his name is on White Gravener?
I have no idea. I have no idea. I have no idea why Moberly's name is on White Gravener. I haven't done enough of the history of the university going forward from the 1820s to know whether there are other family connections.
Do you think that confrontation can go both ways? Like, is it good to be confronted by a name like Isaac Hawkins as well as being confronted by, say, a name like Moberly still on White Gravener?
It very well could be, if you tell the story enough. Where's the name Moberly on the
On White Gravener, the door all the way to the left, like, it's above that.
Okay.
That's really interesting. I heard that from somebody else that I think actually I would have heard from Father Cards that his name was on the building. I can't remember who I heard that from, but recently, within the last year or so.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I think somehow kind of recovering that could be something we talk about. So we have taken the names Muddy and McSherry off. Their names should not pass from our memory. And we probably don't want them as the top names on our buildings, but we certainly do need to, I think they both have a place in our cemetery. It's a place where we look at them and we go and we tell their story. And that story should confront us, it should make us uncomfortable, it should inspire us, it should drive us crazy. That's what real history does to you. If you want a pure history, I don't think you can study history very much.
My name is Father Thomas Murphy. I'm a member of the Society of Jesus, and I'm an associate professor of history at Seattle University, Seattle, Washington. His strong belief was that the plantations would operate better without slavery. Not necessarily that they would become profitable right away through the sale of the slaves itself, but if subsequently operated with free labor, they would make more money.
And what can we do to prevent that in this new wave of awareness and remembrance, that we don't forget like we did in the 60s and like we did in the 90s?
So the memory has to be held by the alumni and by the faculty. And I think it's just a question of determination, a question of resolve that the issue will be kept on the table, that if things start to drift, people will resolve to act prophetic and call the community back to the original issue.
There is bridge building with other Christian churches.
My name is Rachel Swarns, and I'm a reporter with the New York Times. What was really powerful to me about this story is that it shows how slavery affected more than individuals, that it really was the economic engine that fueled the growth of so many of our institutions, including universities like Georgetown. And so it is in many ways not surprising given the history of slavery and its importance in the economy, but it was also history that I knew nothing about. That was my interest, was to kind of use the rich trove of records that the Jesuits took to put the enslaved people front and center. That was a story that hadn't been told, and to show how their, to show how their lives, were important in the growth of the university. And I think, as a journalist, that's important. It was also really interesting to see and to point out that the university had started on this road and was trying to grapple with this history. As many of us, many Americans, many institutions are still trying to grapple with this history. The Jesuits, of course, told the story of and had researched the sale and had written about Jesuit slaveholding before. But they wrote about it from the perspective of the Jesuits, with the focus on decision-making and the activities of the Jesuits. They did not put the enslaved people first and foremost.
My name is Cheryl Lynn Branch, B-R-A-N-C-H-E. In May, I spoke with Richard Cellini, who is director of the Georgetown Memory Project, and he actually called me at work, and he explained why he was calling. And my initial reaction was that I was really glad to know something that I had suspected, always knew I was granddaughter, great-granddaughter of someone who had been enslaved. I am hopeful and prayerful and believe that Georgetown University is preparing to do something very special, something that has not been done before, and certainly in this short length of time that they've been dealing with this historical issue and the significance of the relationship between descendants and the university. In a short length of time, and I'll say this, Rome wasn't built in a day. I expect this marathon to go on for some time, and that it's certainly not a sprint, and that as we continue to engage each other and learn more about each other and our link and our history, which Georgetown fully knows, many of us are still uncovering, that what will come from it is a repair.
I want to thank you all for being here this afternoon, and I wish to welcome all of you again to Georgetown University, to Dahlgren Quadrangle, where we're now gathered, and behind me is Isaac Hawkins Hall. We seek to remember, to honor, and to recognize the lives, hardships, and legacies of Isaac Hawkins and Anne Marie Beecraft. As we learn more about their lives and the context in which they lived, we will ensure their history, our history, is memorialized in these spaces. All of us share in the responsibility, the choice articulated by the historian John Hope Franklin 60 years ago when he provided a new framing of the history of our nation, when he said, what we need to do as a nation and as individual members of society is to confront our past and see it for what it is. Having done that, we should then make a good faith effort to turn our history around.